Welcome to CTG Weekly with Mark and Andre, a weekly podcast where we talk about whatever we want to in games. This week, we're talking about what the new Disney Bob means for video games. We're talking a little bit about World of Warcraft, and mostly, we're going to give our long opinions on God of War. Hi, Andre.
Hello.
So, this week, we're starting with Disney's new CEO. A brand new Bob. A brand new day.
It's true. So it's been an ongoing couple of days of people referring to old Bob and new Bob, which is a discussion about the now ousted CEO of Disney, Bob Chapek, who's been replaced by Bob Iger, except that Bob Iger was also CEO of Disney from 2005 to 2020, thereby really complicating any amount of coverage I read about old and new Bob, because they have both been old and new Bob at different times of this whole affair, which I will continue calling a tale of two Bobs.
Yeah, it is a tale of two Bobs. It's the only thing to call it, really.
Yeah. So I wonder if people listening to this podcast are going to say, well, this is a video game podcast. Where are we talking about the CEO of Disney? Like, this seems like a broader media and film thing, and Disney's not a video game company, right? But
I mean, makes sense
one
to
of the
me.
really interesting aspects of this is that Disney has its hand in a lot of pies, speaking in terms of how conglomerated the company is, how many different sectors they're in, and the kind of acquisitions. And also, it's important to talk about like how a change in CEO can really shift how a company operates. So Chapek was kind of in a righting the ship moment, and Disney is having its worst fiscal year since I think 1976. So it's been going very badly for them. And they're bringing Iger back in, sort of presumably to right the ship that Chapek has been mishandling. But Iger was notorious for acquisitions. And so, to kind of set the stage, it's important to understand that like Iger's strategy as CEO for Disney was to buy IP and to expand in different markets. And he brought the company's like its market capitalization, so its net value, I suppose, from 48 billion to 257 billion. So he is kind of like the key architect for where Disney stands right now. And chief among these acquisitions are the purchases of studios, like the purchase of Pixar in 2006, Marvel in 2009, and Lucasfilm in 2012. And of course, the mega merger with Fox back in 2019. So all of these aspects have been really important. And one of the discussions that I've been hearing about this a lot on shows like Matt Bellany's The Town, or even Bill Simmons' show, is the discussion of a guy like Bob Iger doesn't come out of retirement to only fix the finances. He comes out of retirement to grow the company's legacy. Like, this is a person who could stay retired and have the historic run of Disney management that has made it bigger. But by all accounts, he is somebody who likes being in the action and likes making deals. Again, why are we talking about video games? Disney is not a video game company. Well, two of those deals that are, sort of floating. So there's a sort of discussion about like, are these things that are going to be happening? So all this is very speculative. On the one hand is a potential purchase of Netflix to combine Netflix's platform infrastructure and distribution model with Disney's IP. So get like their big enduring franchises combined with like Netflix's capacity to put out stuff almost every week and its reach globally, to sort of have a merged platform. The other aspect of this is the idea of Disney getting into video game production directly. So either founding a studio or buying one and converting it into a Disney studio is not off the table. And that hasn't really been a topic of discussion for a while. Like, Disney generally sells out IP contracts to companies to produce games, right? So we can think about EA getting to make Battlefront 2, and the Jedi Fallen Order games, or Quantic Dream now making Star Wars Eclipse. Like, those are some that we can think about. There are also MCU games, so Crystal Dynamics' Avengers game. Like those are the kinds of deals that we can think about,
Yeah.
or even the Insomniac Spider-Man and upcoming Wolverine game are part of those. But what seems to be like circling this is, well, what happens if instead of selling that IP, they just start adapting it? Like what happens to the industry? And what happens to studios that rely on these properties to make money? What happens to IDOS when they can't make Guardians of the Galaxy or to these companies, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you have a sense?
Do I have a sense? So, like, Disney did have a studio until 2016, I think. Did not go super well. I mean, it went well at different times, but like they've only been out of their own studio for a while, like 6 years or so, right? Although they didn't really
Yeah.
make huge games. Um, Part of me thinks that this is a fairly recent failing, that they wouldn't do this. You know,
Venture back into it.
yeah, I feel like the tendrils of all their licensing effectively is what they're doing here with all their IPs to other game developers is working. But like, I'm not a CEO of a company. I'm not a 71-year-old CEO of a company who came back to make a statement, right? Like, I don't know what that kind of money does to the mind. I don't know what that level of hubris does to the mind. I have some assumptions about what could be done here, but it's not. Yeah,
It's not that clear.
it's really unclear what's going to happen, and I think maybe the actual thing that's occurring on the ground is this sense of flux. As far, I mean, but all we can do about the games part of this is really speculate on where this could go. And the amount of infrastructure they would need to build up to output games on the scale that they are being made now by tons of other companies, by EA, by WB, by Bandai Namco, Square Enix, even with Kingdom Hearts, right? Like, you can't, without a huge investment, put out that level at that quality. It's just not. It's not a thing,
right? And it's going to take years, right? Game development, unlike even TV development, pre-production, production, post, is still like a 2-year, 3-year process, depending on rights negotiations, development, casting, all this stuff. It can go for years. But like, we can talk about games that take 5, 6, 7, 8 years to make. Your ROI is much slower, and we're not going to see this pan out, I think, in any time soon. Really curiously, there are only a couple of ongoing Disney properties that are currently being adapted for video games, right? So I mentioned Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy back in October 2021. Jedi Fallen Order, which was 2021, it does have a sequel coming out that's made by Respawn and EA. Kingdom Hearts 4 is on the way. And Marvel's Avengers from Eidos Montreal and Crystal Dynamics is still ongoing and getting a new character currently. So there are only like a handful of actual Disney games currently. And so there is a wide array of IP to exploit. Like, I mean, I'm not thinking about this for myself, but like I can imagine, a room of executives looking at franchises like Frozen or Coco and thinking, wow, well, we should, why aren't we getting these kids on games? Why aren't we getting Star Wars fans on more games? Why aren't we getting like more out of our IPs currently? And as like the MCU ramps up towards the next phase, and we get, the X-Men are coming back, presumably the Fantastic Four are coming back, presumably. There's a lot of franchises to exploit for video games. And so it's like, I agree with you. There's this thing of like, the company, Disney Interactive Studios, which ran from when I was born, 1988 to 2016, has been more or less successful, but it's never been like a powerhouse game development studio, and it is a sector for them to expand into.
It was way more
Like,
publishing. Like even what Disney Infinity that they did, they just published that. Like it wasn't an in-house developed project, but it was the thing that ended up tanking Disney Interactive, right?
I'm pretty sure, yeah.
Yeah.
And looking through like the listings really quickly, like I don't think Disney Interactive has had anything since 2014 that was developed by them. So even prior to Disney Infinity, like they weren't producing that much, and there were so many like IPs back in the early to mid 2000s, stuff like My Disney Kitchen, developed by Atlas, right? Like Disney Golf, developed by TNE Soft, right? And published by Capcom. Like there's a bunch of, thinking of Disney and Pixar IPs the way that like Disney treats its IPs now, with like things like Mario Party and Mario and Sonic at the Summer Olympics, and like that's kind of what I have in mind when somebody's telling me that like Disney wants to get in on the action. They also have the new card game that is apparently retailing singles at like absurd prices right now, which I cannot remember.
I heard nothing about this card game.
So,
but I'm not all aboard that Disney train.
Lorcana is the name of the game, which is a sort of crossover. So it's Disney, but it's sort of Disney's take on sort of the Magic the Gathering / Yu-Gi-Oh franchise.
Okay.
Features characters like Mickey Mouse, Frozen's Elsa, Robin Hood, Stitch, like just a bunch of heroes. Has colors like Magic does. It looks like a functional TCG. Like it might actually be very good, but apparently they only sold a couple of sets of first edition cards at D23 Expo. The company that's making these, so Disney is the IP. They always tend to do this, right? Disney's sort of like the IP owner, and the developer is Ravensburger of Ravensburger Puzzles. And so, for example, one set of 6 cards sold for $2,000 US in resale. So we're like, I'm getting some strong like flesh and blood.
That's what I was going to ask. Are they doing the flesh and blood model? Are they going to start shredding cards to raise the value?
I don't think they need to. So this seems to be a physical game, especially since Ravensburger is making it, and they're sort of notorious for making like collector's items for like homes and tables, and not a digital model. And like you combine that with like Disney IP, and you've suddenly got something akin to like Funko Pops.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's another vector of IP distribution for them to take into account. And I'm, like it's not really too difficult to think of like them getting into TCGs, them getting into more board games, them setting up a Fantasia TTRPG if they want to, because D&D is big. Like there's a number of things that I can imagine a Disney-owned game studio could do that companies right now have to fight extremely tight brand access. So for folks who might remember, like Battlefront 2 is a case of Disney loaning out the Star Wars IP to EA, and still recipient of the most downvoted comment in Reddit history. Like Battlefront 2 got lambasted for its loot box model and like how it gated legendary characters, and that ended in large part because of consumer outcry. But Disney corporate stepped in to threaten EA with lawsuits because they were devaluing Disney IP. And so Disney, we can talk about at a world scale like how predatory or not Disney has been in terms of like markets and what it does. But in the game ecosystem, it's actually very interesting because they hold the integrity of their IP and their brand name sacrosanct compared to what a lot of current game studios are willing to do to eke out money.
Yeah.
And Disney's not hurting to eke out money. Like what they want is a long-term development of a new sector, not a quick profit.
Yeah, and it's also when we're thinking about like what are they going to do? Those companies, like the game companies, whether it's Ravensburger or Warner Brothers or whatever, they get a lot of mileage out of those IPs, right? And
Mm-hmm.
do we? And not all of the games are quality, but there are certainly some quality products being made with those IPs. Like, do you think Bob Iger is gonna come in and like burn all those bridges? Like, because that's also a bad look, especially for fans of like Fallen Order, of like the villainous board game. Like, there is such a thing here where they make this move to internalize all their own ludic development, and it completely burns fans because they've established a relationship to these products as developed by those teams.
Well, I'm thinking about it like this, right? So for years, Disney fought Pixar on animation, right? Like they were concurrent competitors for many years before Disney bought Pixar. And eventually Disney's approach to a lot of these other big companies like Lucasfilm and like Pixar has been to say, I'm just going to buy them. Like we're not going to fire these people. We're not going to make them not work anymore. We're just going to make them ours. Like they're going to be working for us directly, and we're going to have like higher control, and they're going to be happy because they're going to have much less red tape to get access to IPs, and we're going to be able to leverage stories that people have been loving for 70 years. Like if I told my mom right now that there is a sort of Magic the Gathering card game that can offer her like that sit down experience, but she can play like Minnie and Goofy and Donald, she'd be in just because of the IP. So I think there's a lot to sell for like you can sell the idea that clients are going to have really high uptake. And so the question for me isn't like, does Disney put like IDOS out of business by like denying them a contract or something?
Oh, it's just outright just buy them and they become Disney games.
Do they just buy Insomniac,
right,
and have them make Marvel games forever because Insomniac is making fantastic product already? Do you open a studio next to a current studio and just offer better pay and better advantages and collect all the high ranking talent who can like eke out 20 cents more on the dollar for their work, and then gets to say that they've delivered AAA products for Disney? Like, they didn't fight. They negotiated with Sony because presumably like Sony doesn't want to get bought out, but they didn't negotiate for Fantastic Four or X-Men. They just bought Fox. Like that was the result, was like, we're not going to have to deal with this problem. And the question then becomes, right, like thinking beyond games, and I know you and I have had a lot of discussions about this, is like Disney's not blind. Like Iger is the architect behind Disney Plus existing, like it arriving on the market, and it's been sort of a financial drain, but at the same time it's been a motor for IP expansion, for better or worse. We can talk about like the Marvel TV shows versus things like Andor. Not everything hits, but Iger is a person who grew up on linear television and on legacy media, and yet is somebody who seems poised to embrace new media, right? And so if you get to a point where you're starting to abandon linear television and theatrical production and you're moving more into a streaming digital ecosystem, I wouldn't be surprised to hear that like Disney is just straight up purchasing a big studio in the US in like a year. The question is which one is more where I'm trying to think. And it seems silly to think about this because we're saying like, well, they're going to buy a studio, and people are going to say, well, yeah, studios are enormous, right? Like Ubisoft, for example, employs more people than Universal Picture does, or Paramount, I'm pretty sure. So these companies are massive. But it's not that long ago that we were reading news about Ubisoft being purchased by Vivendi, which is another multinational that is involved in sort of the media enterprise. And it's, the idea is more like studios like this want to diversify revenue streams They want as many sectors as possible so that if any sector fails, the other ones can like absorb the hit, and the company keeps trucking. And Disney's got a big video game shaped gap in the offerings that could be exploited.
Yeah. Interesting to see what they do with it.
Yeah. So
all I know is this: they better make that second season of Andor. Bob,
well,
my man.
I'm pretty sure one of the things I can tell you is if I did not misread this, new old Bob's first two mandates was to put the Andor producers in charge of all Star Wars content. And the second one was to sort of reaffirm Disney's commitment to animated content, sort of producing more animation in the future, which had seemed a bit shaky under Chapek.
More animation. That more Andormation, maybe. I would approve of that. Yeah, putting those folks in charge of that would be a good start. Put them in charge of games and then acquire a game company, and I think you're going to end up making some great stuff.
Yeah, the idea that it's a story game and an IP game more than it is, or in as much as it is also a medium game. Like you need to understand TV and film production, but like if you've got like really good stories and really good scoping, you can probably do a lot with that.
Yeah, and we're gonna talk a little bit about the story game in a second, but before we do, we had some World of Warcraft discussion to get onto, as we are 4 days out, I believe 4 days out from the release of the new expansion, Dragonflight, and the release of new expansion time is always full of excitement and possibility before the inevitable disappointment wave comes crashing upon you when you realize a game.
Monday, right?
Yeah, it comes out Tuesday at 6 p.m. on the East Coast, which is where we are.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I'm excited and scared.
Yeah, no. I mean, listen, there were some things that you wanted to hear about. So if there's anything you wanted to ask me about, please, by all means.
So we almost had this discussion off mic, but you figured it might be better for folks to hear. So I've been intermittently checking in. I haven't played on the pre-patch, and now we're about as close as we can be, right? I expect that there's not much more change to see occurring in the game balance stuff. So I suppose I just have a couple of questions for you on how you feel about how the game is shaping up. And especially like the promo material. So maybe I'll segment it into a couple of questions. So like, how do you feel about the story, like the story that they seem to be setting up to tell with all these shorts and the new cinematic and everything?
I'm loving it. I'm having a great time. They're really bringing it back to more of that you're an adventurer feel, and if you're a bit unfamiliar with the way World of Warcraft has worked across its history, when you started in this game, you were just an adventurer killing boars and stuff, and you wouldn't be fighting the big world-ending villains a la every Marvel movie has to collapse the planet. But, alongside that, the stakes need to be enormous move that we had in pop culture. Of course, this long-standing MMO took the same thing, and pretty much going in from expansion 4 to the last one, however many that actually is, it's quite a few, probably four to five expansions long, of like every villain you fought was like a world-ending catastrophe, and you were some kind of champion or hero, right? Which kind of disrupts the whole fantasy of an MMO where you're playing with like tens of thousands to millions of other players, depending on how you want to scope this in your mind, because you're never actually playing with a million other players. But how can you all be a world-saving hero? It doesn't really work, right? And I think being kind of not a nobody, but you are an adventurer. You are a powerful adventurer, and it brings the team up fantasy a bit more to life. Like, it all connects a bit more in that feeling. And like, so there's a new race class combo that come out, the Drakthir, which are these dragon folks. They can only be one class, the Evoker, and they have either a healing or a damage. They're either a mage or like a healing. They're a healing healer is what they are. But you can
Really
only
mad.
ever be like one of these two classes with this race, but they have their own starting experience. It's really short. Like takes about an hour to actually get through it. And you start at the level where the expansion will start at, which I was very pleasantly surprised by, because if you buy the deluxe version you get a character boost, but you also just get access to this new class which also starts ready to go as a way to get new players into the game. And that lead up, that story, I found to be really fun. Like, it was quick, it was snappy. I've played through it twice already for characters on different servers,
Mm-hmm.
and I love the way it feels. They're bringing in new mechanical elements, like you have to hold a button and release at the right time to get the desired effect. And they give you kind of a preview of the new flight mechanics that are in the game, because flying really didn't work with physics in any meaningful way. You just floated in the air on whatever flying creature you were on, and you can just go up and down, left and right, and it's like you're just floating. There's no dynamics, there's no lift, there's none of this. Now there is, and they have a built-in ability called soar, and it throws you up in the air, and you actually have to, like, you end up descending, and you have to like angle your body downwards to get momentum, and then you can curve back up. And this is part of what the dragon riding thing is, which is one of the big features of this game, which seems fairly minimal given that there have been flying mounts in this game forever, but actually it's really fun. And if the new zones, like the starting zone, uses the space and is built around the idea that you have this really fun traversal mechanic built into the game, it's creating this whole new vector of like exploration and adventure experience that hasn't been in this game. Like, they haven't taken any real large steps in that direction in like 16, 17 years.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I was actually really excited by, like, they train you by like flying through different sets of rings using this mechanic, and I was like, this is a nice fun way to break up what this game has traditionally been. And really, I think there's just kind of a whole philosophy shift that they've had, where the game doesn't feel like it has felt, and it's probably worth checking out even if you've never checked out before. If you played WoW back in the day and are like, I'm definitely not in for what this game is about anymore. I don't think it's more of the same in like the philosophical underpinnings of what the design of this game is, right? It is an MMO, so if you don't like it for that reason, like, it still expects you to be at least somewhat social. It still has the same like combat and collection and completionist mechanics that a lot of these games have, but there is a different feel here in several different vectors that I would have to say, like, this is worth checking out, and I'm really excited to see what it actually feels like in practice.
Amazing. Yeah, I mean, my partner, who is somebody who has never touched a World of Warcraft game, is considering buying a PC just because the Dragonflight, like the dragon flying, looks fun.
Yeah, it
Like,
does
no
look
other
fun.
she's like, I can't play this on any other game. Like, no other game seems to be doing this, which is also like a kind of a really interesting thing of like, we're maybe half a decade out of How to Train Your Dragon.
Mm-hmm.
How are we not inundated with Dragonflight training games? Like,
Yeah.
I feel like, I know there was a recent like kind of dogfighting dragon game, but I heard it didn't review particularly well, or it didn't make a dent.
Like, do you remember the
Since I played
Panzer
it.
Dragoon series for like Sega
Oh
Saturn?
no!
Like,
Yeah,
how have we not been there?
I owned that game as like one of 6 games I had on Sega Saturn
Yeah.
in Venezuela. So
No, it's incredible.
Oh.
And yeah, I mean, I do have to say, like, the aesthetic of this too, it's not grimdark. They tend to, I mean, the last few expansions have been fairly dark in the way they look, and this is not. It feels like a very colorful adventure. I mean, the dragon aspects are like, they're all a different color. The dragons that make up this pantheon of powerful leaders in the lore, the dragon flights themselves are, you have your blue, red, green, gold, black dragon flights, and it creates, like, they're really leaning into the aesthetic of that in the way the last time they revisited this aspect of the lore in their story was about 10 years ago, and they really failed to like bring that flavor of what their dragons are like to life. But if
Yeah.
you've seen any of the promo material for this expansion, there and the way the zones are designed, it is colorful. It feels
Yeah.
lively. And I think that's a
This,
good choice for a post-pandemic, if we could call it the post-pandemic. But you know what I mean, game,
yeah.
right? Of like, we need something with a little more hope, a little more vibrancy, and something that's a little less, I don't know, taxing on our faculties, I think.
We don't need, like, Elden Ring was fine once every couple of years, but like I don't need every game to be Elden Ring in
No,
tone.
exactly. And especially for a
Yeah.
game like WoW, where it is one kind of progressing story, you don't want to live in that darkness zone for years on end.
You telling me that having a zone called the Maw for like 3 years where everything is dead and sad wasn't inviting?
Especially when that came out, because that was like, if you were in Canada, our
Exactly
lockdown
during the
felt like
worst.
it lasted 2 full years, honestly. And that came out pretty early into a lockdown that didn't seem like it was
Well,
ending. Uh,
my
and yeah, it was grim.
my take on the last expansion was like I really enjoyed areas like Bastion and Ardenweald that were like very, like they had different color palettes. Like there was maybe sometimes like cold blue or sepia or like
Ardenweald
very
is beautiful. Yeah.
Ardenweald is like dark blue and purple and whatever. And when I was watching trailers about this yesterday, like the sort of zone breakdown with my partner, there's like a zone for Azure dragons. There's like this sort of crimson pink forest that seems like really like all these zones look really inviting. And even if I'll be honest, like the Titan storyline for people who are longtime WoW fans isn't like a thing that gets me actively excited. I'm not like against it either, but the general look of what we're getting is very appealing to me, to the point where like I am kind of like buried under work and other games to play currently, and I find myself now some 4 days before it's releasing being like, am I actually just buying this like now? Like, is this a thing that's happening even though I hadn't planned for it?
That's what happened with me. Is I had some free time left because I recruited some friends to play who eventually stopped playing in Shadowlands, but they forgot to cancel their subscriptions, and so I got some free game time that I didn't know I had, but I found it and I was like, I'll see what this is about. And then as I was getting into it, and through the two pre-patch cycles, most recently with the evokers, I was like, I'm just really enjoying this, and I found it a very relaxing game experience to play compared to the game we'll be talking about in a minute, especially as I was just leveling up my characters to figure out what I wanted to actually play in Dragonflight, as I was playing concurrently with God of War. I was just like, this is peaceful and fun, and I'm kind of into what the adventure might be ahead of me in a way that I haven't had with WoW in a long time, where I've always been a bit apprehensive. I keep going back for like every new expansion, and very early into it, I'm just like, ugh, no. But I've always had that feeling like that's the way it's going to go. Here, I'm not so sure.
I think the last time I felt like this excited about like a prospective area was like Legion.
Yeah.
So like three expansions ago, and just being like, well, I can't wait to go to Suramar and see what's up there. And that was like that for me was the payoff of the expansion. I know we went back and we did some later content where like you go to a different world, and that stuff is, not my vibe aesthetically, but like it was very cool. And like I felt like BFA was kind of a holdover. I did enjoy like the Dino Zone on the Horrid side, and what is it called, Zuldazar. Like I did
Something like
enjoy
that.
it, despite like, we could talk about some ethical problems with representation of trolls in World of Warcraft.
Yeah,
It's
I
like a
did not
different
like that
discussion.
zone. But
But it was colorful. The dinos were cool. Whereas like I felt like a lot of the rest of that expansion was very bland. Like it really didn't have much variation. And like when expansions continue and they add more zones, we got we got like Najatar, the underwaters, like the middle of the ocean zone that was kind of like gray and brown, and then like the end of that expansion was like purple and brown. Like there wasn't. It was just kind of like, okay, this is fine. And Shadowlands, my problem with it is that it starts real strong, and of the 5 areas that you play, I think like the 2 strongest are like 1 and 3, and like
Yeah.
2 and 4 are fine, and 5 is horrible. And then we didn't stick around. Like I cannot tell you anything that happened after the first season of Shadowlands that ended with Castle Nathria. A fantastic dungeon, by the way, and I really did enjoy Revendreth because I'm, I will sell out if there's any kind of vampires in my games for cultural reasons.
I love that raid. I thought it was great.
That was fantastic, but like I didn't go back, and I didn't feel the need to go back. And everything we saw afterwards with like the story developments, I just grew more and more disappointed. And maybe hitting the reset button and lowering the stakes and just having like more contained stories about like these cool characters that you don't hear about.
I really think the developers felt it too. Like there was clearly a sense that something needed to be different. I don't know fully about this, but I know there are some different people in charge now, and it shows. Like it's different. I don't know how different it's going to be once we actually get into it, because again, we're just, we're in the dip our toes in. We got to see a single hour of a new zone. Well, for us, I'm not a beta player. Other people on the beta have been obviously done a bit more on this, but I think the other thing though to support some of this is that the general vibe of like WoW content creators too, who I've been following just to get a better sense of like what is the culture saying as we get into this new period of the game. It's a lot of optimism that I have not seen for World of Warcraft since Wrath of the Lich King. Like there is a hope here. Like people want this to be good. A lot of people who played the beta are like, this is in a good spot to make some good progress for this game. And I hope that pans out. And I'm really excited to take that ride if it does.
Cool. Yeah. So we've been talking a lot about like the new mechanics and the story and like philosophy. So I suppose you haven't tried any. You're on the pre-patch or not on the beta, so you haven't tried any dungeons and raids. So unfortunately, we can't speak to that.
There is a new dungeon already in the pre-patch.
Have you tried it?
The Legacy of Tyr, I think it's a Uldaman. It's a redo. They remade
you tried
it.
That one?
Yep, it's great.
How is it?
It's fun.
Fantastic.
Seems well designed. It was fast. It wasn't confusing. Seems like it's a good setup to be done on Mythic. Looks great. It made me want to play more, and there just isn't game until Tuesday, really.
Okay. I suppose before we wrap up on World of Warcraft, now that we're this close to the pre-patch,
the launch?
Yeah. Sorry, to the launch of the new situation, I guess. What's your sense for the classes now that things have like settled a little bit? Have there been, we talked about we talked about shamans and shamans kind of getting kneecapped a lot, and warlocks as well.
Okay,
I personally have been checking out hunters, and does not look fantastic for me on that front. So
one of the hunter specs is incredible based on like I've been looking at a lot of tier lists to try and get a sense of where, like, what is the average of where things are being placed, right? And Hunter has the worst spec in the game and one of the best specs in the game right now. So if you love beasts, you're in for it. And if you love bows, you are bottom of the barrel.
I'm so sad.
There are a few marksman advocates, but not a lot.
My sense was that like the way that the tree is set up for marksman, you effectively have to like completely change the way you play the game between like doing dungeons and doing anything else. Like,
well, so with the way the talents are working now in general, you, I think, now have to get way more used to, if you want to do like a wide variety of content, you need to get used to having a couple different ways of playing, which is, I mean, there are specs for whom this would probably not be true, but even what I've seen, if I'm going into a dungeon with like a boss that has two mobs in the encounter, I'm probably going to have my talents slightly different. So
It's fair.
it's
Yeah, my sense. I was looking at like Demon Hunter because when I saw that hunters weren't doing so good, I was looking at tanks,
yeah,
and my sense is that like tanks are a bit more uniform. Like you can
they're mostly
afford to
good.
play, you can afford to play like the tree that you want to play everywhere. Like there are some exceptions where like a mythic. So for people who haven't played WoW in a while, right? Generally, it's like you have your overworld / questing tree. You have your mythic plus dungeon tree, which generally is built for like bossing but also pack clearing, and then you have your raid build, which is generally for like one boss kind of encounters. And like my sense was that tanks tend to not have to mess around so much, but some of the DPS I was seeing, I was like,
Yeah, no, I
wow,
mean,
it's like
so DPS mechanically, I mean, this is a person who's played WoW a lot and has never found DPS particularly complicated. Once you know what you're doing, it's just you execute it again and again. Like, and from, I don't know, from a musician standpoint, every DPS in this game is substantially easier than like learning a song. And like you don't really have to react too much to things in your own rotation. Like you always know once you know what you should be doing, and you just kind of do it. Um, but it's actually really interesting that the game you're playing now as a DPS is bringing the right build for the right moment, even more than before. Whereas, like, you would swap out a couple talents here and there, but now it's like you have to consider this entire line. And so, if you're playing a DPS, I think you now have a bit more decision space in like your macro play that can change the way your rotation functions from moment to moment.
mm,
Which I like. I mean, you're obviously not changing your talents on the fly, but you're, for every encounter, you're gonna in a raid, you're gonna have a different
yeah.
talent.
I suppose I really shouldn't complain too much because I already do this on Destiny. Like I change, like if I'm doing PvE versus PvP, I'm definitely changing
Yeah,
what I spec.
and
So
it's very easy to change because you have loadouts. Like you don't have to re-put in all the individual nodes. Like you can just be like, this is this, this is this, this is this. It's they. Yeah, I know in your mind because you haven't been back. You're like, this is going to be so tedious to do because it's World of Warcraft.
I
No,
thought I would have
you
to
just have
manually
pages.
unspec.
No, you can make 5 different pages to be like single target, 2 target cleave, multi-target,
Okay. Okay.
single
Okay.
target different build, so that you can, because there are now, which I think is really interesting, within their own spec, multiple things you can do. Like enhancement shaman is one of the good ones, in that it has like a fire line, a lightning line, a frost line, and you can mix match these together to create the one that you want. Although obviously if you're min-maxing, you know what you're going to do based on all the data that exists.
Yeah.
But you can, if you want, and I think you should do this, take a hit to your DPS to play in a way that is more comfortable or fun or engaging for you. Like seriously,
Yeah.
find a group of people who are going to allow that, because unless you're, pushing the hardest mythic keys or doing mythic plus rating, you don't
I
need to
would
do that to succeed in this game. You really do not. And I would really encourage anyone listening to like stop pressuring players in like low keys or just random content to do that shit, because man,
I'll
you
have
don't have to.
I'll have to check out um how Havoc Demon Hunter is doing, because this was one of the things that really got me sort of a bit in on Vengeance, which is the tank spec for Demon Hunters. Was like, well, theoretically, like the build that puts sigils on the ground is superior, but it requires more micro, and you need to like mess around with your camera to be able to ground target properly and all this, which is like sometimes in WoW has been a bit annoying when you're tanking to also have to do like a giant ground target thing.
Yeah.
But there's apparently like a soul bomb like omnidirectional build that is like a few percentage points less efficient, but appeals to me much more mechanically. And this is a sentiment I've been seeing from a lot of people commenting, which is like, you much prefer like a player that is comfortable playing like a B plus tier build than someone who's playing like an A tier build but poorly,
No, you
or like is
100%
incapable of
do.
executing.
unless you're pushing for
and
the
not having fun.
tippy top. Like WoW has not been so tightly tuned in its mid or high mid game for a very long time, where you can't actually have flex. Like if you're pushing the hardest content, that is not what I'm talking about here. But like it is not at the levels most people play this game. You do not need to fucking push people into min-maxing their characters. This is
Right.
like this is a part of the culture that really needs to like check itself here, because the game is not about that for most people.
Right. So final wrap up for this, because maybe we, in that spirit, let's not rank classes and be
Right.
like, this is the best class.
It's impossible
Are
to
there
know.
any are there any like real traps where you're like, I understand everybody should be able to play whatever they want to play, but these are like in a state right now that like you are like fighting against the game if you're trying to like enjoy your time with them?
So my understanding is that marksman hunter is like really bad. Restorations shaman as well has gotten a lot of dislike. It's just not effective and doesn't bring what the other healers do. And this expansion is really interesting because across all the tier lists, most things are sitting around S, A, high B tier together. So most things are at least very closely aligned.
Right.
Like most
We're
folks
talking
who
about
play those
PvE.
classes love, yeah, in PvE, I have no idea what the PvP rather situation is for this game right now. I haven't done any since I came back. Actually, I've just been enjoying bopping mobs and doing some dungeons at low levels. But
Don't worry, we can go do twos and I'll tank your MMR.
outside of those two, everyone thought Guardian Druid was going to be terrible going into the expansion. They got a huge buff and are now like they're probably the best tank, just because of how crazy their damage has gotten because of that buff. Like I think they gave it a 50% buff across the board. I might not be right on that, but I think that's what it was.
Am I playing a bear for the first time?
Apparently it's boring as hell, but I don't know. I played a bear in Battle for Azeroth, I think, for a while. I actually had a good time, but it's not like the most thoughtful play style. It's pretty like I don't have to think too hard about what this is, which for me is not what I really enjoy. Some of the other tanks though are just loaded up with utility, like Brewmaster Monk, Paladin. They just have so much you can talent into and do to help your team. And it feels really fun. The tanks actually feel like support tanks now a little bit. I don't know what they all feel like. Blood DK is apparently like awesome in dungeons.
Oh, interesting. I was like really scared that it was gonna have, for people who have never played a Blood Death Knight, they tend to like favor taking more damage to increase their healing, and that generally has made them a bit risky early on in expansions. Like they take a lot of damage compared to other tanks, so it's nice to hear that they're in a good spot right now.
Yeah. I mean, it's still hard to know because they'll always come out with like, here are some changes for patch day on the day this releases, right? And so I'm staying very open to whatever I make on Tuesday when I finally get around to logging into this game to play through this next expansion. I'm literally deciding on that Tuesday what it is.
The Lost Ark way.
Exactly. You figure it out. You do it live. That's what we got to do. But yeah, interested to see where this goes and how I feel next week about it after a few days of playtime. Yeah, so let's move on to another game that we experienced with 2 days of playtime. God of War Ragnarok. So Andre and I have both finished God of War. I just mainly played through the story with some side content in the early parts of the game, and then Andre has. You finished your platinum?
I did. So there's nothing else for me to see in the game.
You've seen it all.
Yeah.
I, from a very different vantage point, also feel as though there is nothing else for me to see in the game. But I guess we'll get into that. How would we like to begin this? Because I don't only want to criticize this game.
So maybe because we've come off, in the last episode we had like kind of I don't want to say like a teardown of the game, but we were pretty critical about it, and I know we have some critical stuff to say now. So maybe we move through this on a couple of like different vectors. I have some ideas about how we can do this. So we can talk about, music, narrative, cinematics, and then move into the aspects that I think we have some more issues to kind of isolate them out so we can talk about the other stuff so it doesn't feel like the whole game is overpowered by that, or maybe it is. And then we can talk about sort of all this stuff coming together. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, sounds good.
All right, so I mean, uncontroversially, I think we're both big fans of the music in this game and the sound design, right?
Yes, it's awesome.
Okay.
I have nothing bad to say about it.
We had a discussion a couple of days back where we were like 10s all the way down.
Yes. It's the music is just good. Thank you for doing the music. I appreciate you.
Yeah. So that part I think we're like very in on. In terms of, if you want to call it graphical design, cinematography, zone design, aesthetically, like speaking of like the flavor of the places that you go in this game and what you get to see, I think I'm also at a 10. Like I got everything.
Yes.
All the
I love what you've given me here. A big frozen lightning bolt in the sky. Please, more of this. This is filling me with joy. And one of the highlights of this game for me, every time I went by that thing, I was like, what a fucking cool idea that was.
Yeah. Maybe also, I'll re-spoiler tag this. We are now talking about like our post-game impressions, so we are going to be going into details.
Oh yeah, we're going to spoil this
narrative, the gameplay, all of the itemization, like everything's on the table now. So, if you want to play this game, my take at the end of this is like, this is still an 8.5 game. There are pieces of it that are like complicated to mix. Still highly recommend to anyone is my vibe. Maybe consider playing with the difficulty if you're not having a good time. That's going to be like my one caveat before we really get into
I actually can't give a recommendation until I talk a bit about my overall feelings about this game.
Okay.
But I mean, play if you haven't, play the first one first. Play the first one of this game.
Yeah.
I think it is better than this game overall as an experience.
Yeah. So the narrative.
Yeah.
The story of this game.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel about it?
How I thought it was fine to good. I feel like on the premise that was set up in the first game, I think they wanted to backtrack a little bit from what that was, and they went in a different direction to tell a couple of different, parent-child stories. And that's what the strength of this is. Although I think they misdirect you a little bit and they spend too much time setting up characters that are integral to making that parent-child relationship work as villains. Like, I don't think they committed fully to either what they set up at the end of the first game or to that parent-child story they're trying to tell in this game. And so by the time it ended, I was actually disappointed mostly with most of the ways the premise set up in the first game could have played out here. That's kind of where I got to.
I'm gonna split it up into, I think, three strands to talk about the narrative. This game as a Norse mythology Ragnarok adaptation, I think is really cool. Like, to me, that is sort of a B+ take on the mythology. There's an enormous amount of interesting renditions of characters that I think are really cool. Even characters that pop up fairly late in the story. Like
this part Freyr I love.
And Heimdall is amazing as a character.
I like all the characters. I love the characters as well. I think they're all great.
Surtur, the Valkyries, all this stuff. Like, the aspect of having Ragnarok be sort of this coming together of multiple characters that you care about and not from the Norse mythology perspective of the Aesir gods generally, I think is a really interesting twist.
Yeah.
And I think the way that the mythology positions Thor and Odin, which we can talk about in a second, is also really strong. So all that, like the mythological component of it is really good. And then I think there are two games narratively in this, which we sort of felt was a bit of the tension in our last review, which was like there's a Kratos game and there's an Atreus game, and I think they need each other to function the way that the game is built. So I can't really like say we should divorce them, but I do find that the Atreus game is lacks a strong conclusion. Like it's the
Yeah.
setting up for future games aspect of the franchise. We're very clearly now we are probably going to be going to cultures that we saw in triptychs in the first game. So probably uh, Egypt, Japan, and like Ireland or Scotland, like the Gaelic mythology stuff, which we also there are references to Nimue and like Arthurian myth in the previous, so there might be a thing of like maybe he's Atreus in Greek and Loki in Norse, but maybe he's Merlin in the Arthurian world.
Yeah.
Or like there are aspects of this where like this franchise is very clearly going to hop to a different culture to tell those mythological stories. So I think my problem is the Atreus thing never gets a proper ending that I like. I think the Kratos end is very strong. Like they had a very clear sense of where they wanted this franchise to end for him.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe it ends for him and maybe it doesn't. But that part really worked for me. And I didn't tell you about this, but like when you get to, he sees the backside of the triptych and
Yeah.
I was just crying. Like that, the last 30 minutes of this just like completely destroyed me.
I thought that was really good. Although here's I wrote a little thing about this for this because what that moment actually was, and if you guys are if you don't remember what it is, you see him and it pans across this triptych that's like showing his life and all the things he did, and at the end there's a statue of him, or it's him. I don't fully
I think
know
it's him being worshipped.
It's him being worshipped, right? And there's one character in the game, I think it's Freya, but it may not be, tells him earlier in the game about like you didn't do the god thing right because no one worships you, right?
Odin.
Oh, it's Odin. Odin tells him. It makes sense. The antagonist of the game would do that, but I didn't remember them engaging too much, and so I was like, I think that's Odin, but I couldn't remember for sure. And at the end, the big reveal is that he's worshipped. But that panel is this meta commentary on Kratos as a figure in games and what the rhetoric of this rebirth of God of War has done for what games can be, right? It's very much in the story. Like, I'm sure if you've listened, you've heard about how Hollywood and the Academy always loves the movies that are making these meta commentaries about Hollywood and the industry. And that's exactly what this was, as they've elevated this broy hack and slash PlayStation 1 character who was in rap battles with Parappa the Rapper and selling you Mountain Dew into this story about parenthood, right? About, emotion, about art, about this whole games as art idea that for some reason people push against because they can't imagine that a game could be art in the same way a picture could be art, right?
We're constantly fighting with the ghost of Roger Ebert, right? The like games will never be art. I think that is going to haunt us for, I think,
an absolutely nonsense comment at pretty much any time in the history of games that you could say that.
I will say, like, devoid of the meta commentary aspect of this, that triptych. So, I mean, one way to read it is that it's about him being worshipped. I think it's about him being loved.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that Odin tells him, right? Like, you've never felt love. Like, you've never been loved. And so I think one of the reasons why the Kratos game works for me is I want to offer this up to you and have your take on it, is because I've played the other games, and Odin is less aggressive, but very much like Zeus is in the first trilogy. And so there's a strong parallel. Like, this game's parallel isn't father son, it's actually grandfather, son, and child.
Okay.
And so it's Odin. Odin is positioned as kind of like a replication of like all the abuse that made Kratos into a monster. And that's why like Thor is positioned the way he is, and like the ending. And so I found the dynamic of like what you see with Odin early on, like, you know, about a third of the way through the story, when you meet him in Svartalfheim and he like berates Kratos for being kind of a shitty god, is that like Odin's actually doing it for his self-serving needs, and in the end ends up being hated by everyone, and Kratos is kind of on the inverse trajectory despite everything that happened in the previous series of games. So that's why I think like those aspects work for me, because none of them feel cheaply inserted or not done properly. Like the Kratos' redemption for a character who is, you know, kind of one of the most heinous characters in video game history up until the reboot of the franchise, feels earned. Like it feels like I felt like it was a cathartic ending. And you know, I will say, I also think that like the female characters who are around this, like Sif and Laufey played by Deborah Ann Woll.
Yeah, I realized that in the last
Fantastic.
cutscene that she's in, and I was
Just
like,
like a
"Oh,
fantastic
cool,
character.
yeah." And it's great. I mean,
Um,
great performance. A bunch of great performances here. I mean,
yeah.
they're good.
So I do think there are some like I took some screenshots in case we end up writing something about this, but like the fucking Valkyrie execution power pose fist pump moment um was like I had a moment of like, oh hell yeah, and then I was like, oh, this is like very like MCU Hollywood, like
Mm-hmm.
time to have a space. But I don't know, it still felt like cool to me. Like there are hell yeah moments, and there are like very, I think, slow pensive moments in the story that worked for me. I think my two outs really are just like the Atreus story just doesn't feel closed off in a way that I would have liked for it to be, and that's, I think,
Absolutely.
because they
I mean,
just want more.
there were a couple articles written about this game that were like, "This is their Godfather 2," and I'm like, "No, I'm sorry, it is not. It is not that here. It is good mostly, especially if we're talking from the story angle, but like." No, they did not like the magic of The Godfather 2 is these two interweaving storylines that come together in a really poignant way in the end to really close off a story in its midpoint, to leave you
I
feeling totally satisfied, and this does not do that.
To your point, I think probably my main problem is that a lot of the swapping over to Atreus advances the plot. Like the swapping between characters advances the sequence of events, right? Like there's no moment in the game where I'm like, wow, this just shouldn't be in the game. Like the
Yeah,
sequence really just doesn't make sense. But there is no increasing resonance between themes of the characters. Like
exactly.
Atreus has no analogous experiences to Kratos. Like he isn't, his moment of relating is to characters like Thrud and Angerboda, and that's like another story. So it's like two stories in parallel that are sometimes crossing into each other, where like The Godfather 2 is really about like parallels between the two characters and how one's experience can be seen reverberating in the other,
Yeah,
right? Like
in a different
that's not
context. In The Godfather 2, it's the case of time and place in some instances of this. Here
in
it's in a case of place, and I guess you're in a different emotional state, but you're not as much as they try and really I'm gonna call it land before timing you into like when you're here you're still here, that kind of thing of like we carry each other in our minds and hearts when you're off doing your own task thing. I don't think they earn where they try and take you to go through all the things that they've made you do in the game as they split up those two characters. I think Kratos benefits a lot from not having Atreus around, especially when he pairs up with Freya. And one of the best aspects of the first game and the end of the first game and in the beginning of this game is the tension in Freya Kratos, right? And like that story really benefits. And as much as I love Angerboda and the Yak, I don't, that stuff exists to set up a future thing.
Well, it sets up the mythological aspect of like those characters do exist in the myth. Like they have to be there. Like for example, in mythology, Angerboda is Loki's wife and is involved in like a lot of the shenanigans. Like that kind of stuff like makes sense to me.
But
I do think you're right that like the resonance between the characters isn't so much between Kratos and Atreus, it's between Kratos and Freya. And that's why like the strongest moments of the story are moments about like Kratos and Freya judging Odin or trying to figure out how they have to deal with Heimdall and Thor and all these other like, you know, damaged characters who are trying to, you know, either break cycles of abuse or are perpetuating them in their own way. I think like Thrud is a fun character. Doesn't do that much for me in terms of like the story advancement or, you know, Skilder.
Well, okay, Thrud reminds me of my wife as a character, and when she gets slapped by Odin, I was furious. Like when he hits her with the hammer and she goes flying, I was like, motherfucker, you killed Thrud, you are dust, my man. Like it produced affect in me. Yeah.
I think like the only character that there was a thing. So I took some notes, right? And I was telling you a couple of days back, like I'm gonna have some predictions that maybe are gonna come true. And I was like, Tyr ain't right. Like halfway through the game, I was like, something's off.
I thought that almost immediately. I was like, this doesn't feel correct to me.
It's interesting because they seed it, and I don't think they fully give it away. So it's like it works for me. And I'll talk to you about some of the post game stuff. Because it wraps up the Tyr and the Sindri arcs the Sindri and the Freya arcs are actually wrapped up in side content post the main game.
Yeah, which I did not get to, and so did not see, and will happily have them spoiled for me. But I think we should talk about why I did not decide to pursue this game any further. And my overall feelings about this game. And in moving past the narrative, I do want to say, while I think there are parts of this narrative that kind of get in each other's way, I did like both parts separately. I just don't think they cohere together super well for the ending. And in relation to the first game, I think that it doesn't quite deliver on what they envisioned at the time. This is maybe better than what they wanted to do, because it certainly seemed like they were setting up to nuke Kratos completely. And I think this is a much more uplifting, positive ending if this is the last time you get to play in his shoes. But also, let's just say, it could have gone either way and I would have been fine with it. That's not my main problem with the narrative. I still think the story is great to play through. I think it has a ton of really emotional moments and great performances. And like, it's a 9 or 10 or whatever if you want to put a number on this. I really did enjoy this part of the game. And in leading into this next part, I basically dragged myself kicking and screaming through every other part of the game just to see where this story went.
So do you want to classify this as gameplay, or do you want to split it up in terms of like puzzles and combat?
I don't need to split it up because it's all in the same kind of boat for me, man.
Didn't work is the
didn't work. They didn't work in a few different ways. So I guess let's start about like puzzles and traversal for me in this. Compared to the first game, like the way the boat segments were built here was really weird because they still relied on the same, like, we're going to tell stories and anecdotes in the boat and they're going to get cut off, but you're never really in the boat that long or on the dog cart. For like, I did not complete in this game a single side story in one or two goes of like getting on and off the cart, because you don't actually go that far in any like quote unquote overworld situation here, and it just really broke up what you're supposed to be getting out of those.
I will say I got a lot of those stories. The post game traversal in Alfheim and Midgard is long, like
Okay.
getting to the places where you need to go. And I got a lot of the stories there, or side questing in Vanaheim on the rivers also
Right.
had that. Like those are, I eventually did get them, but I agree with you. I also, I mean, I recently replayed the first one and I constantly cut off stories. Like I don't think I heard a story in full in that game either. So I think like that part I agree with you. I just think it's a problem that the first game also
Yeah,
has.
it's minor to me. Like but if it's a problem in the first game, you know, like I I don't want to like
Yeah.
backseat design your game. That's not what I want to do here. If you worked on this thing and you're probably a great person and you made a great thing, and I'm so sad that I'm going to really tell you about how much I didn't like it. But like, I don't know, make it so that the stories are shorter or the traversal is
Fair.
longer so that you actually get them in like, I don't know, a meaningful chunk, because you take like 15-20 minutes off of hearing that story and then you get back on the cart, they start it again, and then you're literally across the river where you get off. Like, it was kind of a nonsensical pacing to me for that. And you definitely got the stories cut off in the first game too, but man, it was just constant in this where I was like, I'm never gonna finish one of these. Like, and some of them I wanted to, but I'm not just gonna putz around in the boat. Like, that's not what I was about in this. So that's one aspect of traversal that didn't work. I also didn't find, when you're actually just moving around, like like crouching and going through all these different like micro segments of the levels, I didn't find that very enjoyable, like the climbing and stuff. I don't know.
Again, that part's par for the course for me, where like the first game had it too. I don't think it's like it like bothered me. It bothered me when I had to start doing a lot of the post game stuff, and you do have to, you know, basically if you're doing all the side quests, you can do most of the stuff about like the midway point, and then there are new places that open up, or like new things that open up in the after the hell part of the game with
Right.
like Garm, because there are the hell tears, and then post game there are remnants of Asgard that drop everywhere, so you have to like go again and do some of that stuff. So like I think depending on how you do the side questing, the traversal can get more or less annoying. I will say I didn't really find the puzzles too difficult. Like the Nornir puzzles, there are a couple that like stumped me, but not for extended periods of time. However, I will fully admit, by the end, I opened a guide and I was like, Muspelheim lore number 2. Like I just
Yeah.
need to know where the scroll is on the ground,
They're
because this is not like increasing my
okay.
enjoyment of
The
the game.
puzzles are not stumpers. That's not the kind of puzzles these are. These are just like go in the right spot kind of arbitrarily, and it's a lot of looking. There's a lot of looking for angles, and the thing that makes it hard isn't like your brain is thinking about like the logics of the game. It's like, where did the developers hide the right answer? And that's not the kind of puzzle that is interesting to me at all. And there was one after you get the spear to open one of those rune chests where I was just moving this camera around that isn't very
Is that
fluid
one
to
underwater?
move. No, it's not. It's just on the side of a mountain. And it took me 15 minutes. And I was like, this could theoretically be anywhere. I found 2 of the 3 and just walked around the whole zone and was like, I literally have no indication of where this is. And I was going to open a guide, but I actually couldn't be bothered and was just like, I'm just going to go finish this game.
So here's the thing that they never said, but I was like, I wonder if this is true. And so I started tracking it like midway through the game. Um, the chests have an order on them, right? So let's say you have like 3 runes and they're like A, B, C.
Yeah.
In a circle around the chest, like if you were to draw a 360 circle, those objects appear in order. So like let's say the stone is at like degree 0, and then like the B stone is at like 180 degrees. nothing between the two can appear on that side anymore, and so the sea stone is like actually in the chunk that is left
Yeah.
based on the placement of like once I figured that out, it got faster because I was like, well, it can only reasonably be in this direction. And then it's more a question of like, okay, did they put it on the backside of a pillar? There's one that's under a waterfall, so you actually can't see it aside from like a small hue. Is it in the sky? Is it underground? Like some of that stuff. But like, I agree with you that some feel very arbitrary, and like they're not arbitrary. They're all placed, with intent by the designers.
Yeah.
But like, I don't feel like, the legendary chests, the Nornir chests, the lore scrolls, and the artifacts are collectible aspects that I find particularly rewarding. They are part of the DNA of the open world action adventure genre. Like the collectibles are, I'm playing Assassin's Creed Odyssey again for work, and that stuff also has this. So I understand the DNA. Would it be a tighter game if those things weren't in it, or if they were a bit more contained? Maybe. Probably,
or
actually.
just, I don't know, designed to be more interesting than the way they are. But they didn't work for me, and I'm sure there are folks, and I know there are folks who really enjoy those tiny little micro puzzles and just being like, oh, I found this is the spot to stand, and I throw my axe and it does the thing. And to me, it's not rewarding in the slightest. Like, it does nothing. And in fact, I'm just like, all right, time to look up for a minute. There it is. And I just felt like there was so much of that. And I think I would have cared a bit less, because this kind of stuff was in the first game too. And it didn't bother me. Here it bothered me largely because the combat, which is what you spend the most time doing in this game, was not for me, despite enjoying it immensely in the first one. I hated this. How did you feel?
I've had multiple like phases of my feelings about combat in the game. So I think comparing it to the first one's really interesting, because the first one, combat in the first one for like the first 2/3 of the game is axe and fist, which I found is the strongest. And then very late it turns into axe and blades, and the fist is kind of like a replacement to the other two, but you're not like particularly obligated to play it. You only really need to use the weapons if like you're fighting like the Hellwalkers that are made of ice. You don't use the axe on them, right? But you can do that from the beginning of the game. And I think in this installment, the game is really built on a Pokemon style triangle of weaknesses, where like ice is good against fire, and then wind is just good against the other two, kind of, and it has sometimes enemies that are shielded in like steel, and you fight those two. And there's poison and bifrost, which are kind of like side ailments. Lightning is kind of like abandoned more or less in this game. It exists, but it's really limited to some Atreus spells and relics, as opposed to it being part of like the arrows and the magic that you use. It's all more about the sonic. Runic didn't work for me as an element at all. Like the new edition, I just really didn't. Sonic was fine. It was like the light arrows from the first one.
Yeah.
So like the core experience of how you're supposed to use your weapons is, I'm now against a fire enemy, I have to use the axe. Oh, I'm against an ice enemy, I have to use the blades.
Sure.
And then eventually the spear shows back up, and I think the spear is the best part of the game. Like if I had the spear from the beginning,
yeah, I liked the game a
enjoyment would be
lot
much
more.
better.
I liked the game a lot more when I had the spear.
And I'll tell you this because you probably didn't do them. As the bosses get worse and worse, the spear gets better and better, and it is very clear that it is the best because it is the fastest weapon.
Once I had the spear, aside from enemies that had the like the elemental health where you had to use the opposite thing, I only used the spear, and the game was a million times better.
I played unarmed for like the first 7% of the
also
game.
punching. I also punched.
Yeah, I used the Lunda set, which like when you block or punch it poisons.
I caved. I was like, hey, I bet this is probably the best thing to be doing right now, even though it's not the way I want to play this game. And I did it. I threw my axe and I slapped poison on people.
I think there are ways to play differently, but this is very clear. Like, it's not very clearly. It's very easy with minimal investment to make the game feel a lot better in a situation that we were both in where we didn't feel like we were enjoying the game. I'll say this much. The situation is compounded because all of the runic skills feel like trash. The only good runic spell in the entire game is the one that your companion uses, because it's the one that doesn't stop you from using your like your attacks and blocking.
Yeah, and so the build thing, I started this game with a runic build, right? And so none of the shit I was really interested in doing in this playthrough of the game was very good at the time I was using it. There may be a runic build if you're playing one, but early on I just felt really underwhelmed in terms of options and like power and defensive stats as well for investing into making the runic stuff good. It didn't feel good. But even beyond that, very small things like the amount of swarming enemies there were, which I talked about last week. I hated that until the end of the game. It was this case. It's like the way to ratchet up the difficulty for them was to just put a bunch of shit and have it move behind you again and again, including a bunch of weird floating monsters that aren't really dynamic to fight. Just fucking throw an axe at them or spear once you have it. Unload your arrows, just wait for the arrows to come back. Like it's just like, man, this is not fun.
I'll spoil some of the post-game content. One of the last Muspelheim trials is fighting 99 enemies.
Cool.
In one arena battle.
Yeah, great.
And I was like, oh, this is long. I was like feeling it. I was like, oh, okay.
That's what I felt with. I stopped the challenges when you get to the first boss, and I was just like, these are undertuned compared to the rest of the game up until that point. But also, they're not even that challenging. They're just kind of long. Like I'm just kind of running out the timer. I don't know, man.
There are two that are challenge. So I'll take a second here to talk about the Muspelheim challenges, the way that they're done. So you have to do the first 6. So it's like 3 doors, right? Let's call them doors A, B, and C. You do 2 challenges in each door. And then once you do that, they open up a third challenge. So you have like another one. And you do like 2, and then the third door is locked, and you go down into the pit, and you can like do a final challenge. And basically the way it works is it's a 3-button combination for each of the final challenges. So you do like ABC, ACB, BCA, BAC. Like you just do that. And so you have to redo the challenges a lot to get to the final challenges. And the final challenges, you found the boss one. There are 6. There's a boss one. There's the horde enemy one. There's the survive 6 minutes of constant fighting one. There's one that's like the arena's on fire and you have to stay in the circle that's on fire and also fight things. That one's like cool. But like my feeling at the end was like, wow, this is very padded. To be fair, they also said they're not releasing any DLC or New Game Plus or expansions to this. This is like the only thing that has like longevity post game, really.
Yeah.
So I understand why it's there. I didn't like it. I finished it in the first game as well. Like I did all of those challenges.
Yeah, I did.
I had the same feeling back then. They're the same. They're harder in the first game for sure. But I think they're tedious in both, so I'm not like really.
Yeah, I just feel like a lot of that tedium in the first game was offloaded into just the general combat of this game. But that's not the only thing I don't like. There's even things like weapon swapping feels
clunky.
It's clunky as hell, and the game. This is probably my biggest peeve. The thing that made me the most annoyed overall in the game is that the game is telling you it wants you to weapon swap, and weapon swapping most of the time is a liability.
It's really hard, and I also playing unarmed and spear. I don't know if this happened to you, but if you mistime your crap while you're locked on and you're like pressing down button 3 times, you can flip your camera and kill yourself.
All this. I was like, for what the rhetoric of the game and the way you're supposed to play it, all the things that they're telling you about what they want you to do, none of those things felt particularly easy to use. Parry timing, I don't think in this game was hard when it worked, but I thought there was a lot of the time when it's fucking wonky for no reason. Like
I think the parry, all of the parry stuff is a complete trap. My review of that is this is a blocking game. where
Just
parrying is
never parry, just block,
never.
keep that shield up.
So it's block everything that is not red or yellow. If it's red, you dodge, and by the end of the game, if it's yellow, you take the hit in your shield and you use the last rage power, which animation cancels bosses. It's the only thing that actually staggers in the game. And so I played a rage generation set at the end. I swapped like really late in the game. And so like the last fights is basically like block, dodge, and rage
Yeah, the
to never get hit, because if you get hit, you dead.
the other thing I really didn't like is that pretty much everything staggers you if it hits you one time. And so you can't get hit into put your block up. You just get hit in most instances. And the amount of health that the game takes away for you on normal for an average hit is kind of ridiculous. Like, so, I love hard games. I do, but I don't think that is a hard mechanic in a good way. Couple this with the fact that I have this theory that they wanted to make a more Souls-like experience here, where the player was punished a bit more for mistakes and whatnot. But one of the dumbest parts of this game is that they build none of the macro game around that concept. So it's not like you're scouting out your average encounters. They're just throwing shit at you. And it's not as though you're stopping at bonfires and healing yourself back up or replenishing your stuff for cost. You're going into every new encounter, very likely with not full rage, not full health. And so you just have to die a lot of the time to just actually get your first attempt in on a thing. And I was just like, this is such a bad way. If the design philosophy was, let's make this more Souls-like, well, if you do that, you have to make the other parts of the game more Souls-like too.
Okay, so can I have my rant about boss difficulty?
Do it.
Okay, so I spent a lot of time raging at a lot of the fights, and I spent a lot of time when I was angry perusing forums, perusing the Reddit, perusing Twitter threads and videos, reviewing the game from people who were kind of like in a space like us, being like, am I crazy? Because like everyone's giving this game like 94s to 100s on critical scores. And spoiler, the audience score is lower. It's not like orders of magnitude lower, but it is about 10% lower. It's sitting in the 84 range last time I checked. There are some people review bombing it, so probably it's closer to like a 5-6% difference. And all of it, everyone is angry about combat and combat difficulty. A lot of the discussions I was seeing originally were like, well, you know, the game to compare it to naturally, big boss fights, big epic battles, is Elden Ring for this year. And people are saying, well, like in Elden Ring, I feel really rewarded if I learn the mechanics or if I build properly, I can do all these things. So those were people like us who were having a lot of bad feelings about the combat. Then there were people who were really enjoying the combat and were saying, this is the best iteration of Devil May Cry combat. This is the best iteration of Nioh combat. This is the best iteration of Ninja Gaiden combat. And I really do think, because like those games, this game has a rock, paper, scissors elemental design. It is actually in that vein. And those games, when I like sat down and thought about it, are notorious for having bosses like this. Bosses that just cave your face in for an hour at a time until you just learn the exact way that the boss wants you to beat it. And you just it's a repetition boss design.
Yeah.
It's not an exploratory boss design. However, they also make a crucial mistake that Elden Ring made in some of its boss fights, which, you know, we forgive because it's like 4 boss fights out of like 60, as opposed to the few that are here. How are we in 2022 and people are making gank boss fights?
Right.
I have me kill 6 Drekkies in the game. That's fine. I really do not like the double Drekkie fights. You didn't do them. There is a level 10 double Berserker fight that is absolutely heinous. There is a triple Berserker fight that is 1 melee and 2 witches that fly in the sky.
No, I did that one.
With homing missiles.
I did that one.
And that one took me about 3 hours and a half to clear.
Yeah.
And I wanted to, like, there are multiple moments when you get the boss to 0 health, but they don't die because you need to register the execute mechanic. So I just died at 0 health on the boss like a bunch of times, and I got really irate at those aspects of the game. And the final 2 boss fights, which are post, and I'll separate these from the story boss fights, which I think are generally very well tuned and done compared to the stuff that's on the side. The final Berserker, King Hrolf, has the moveset of every Berserker fight simultaneously and is crazy fast and will just clap you. I don't know if you saw the Berserker that just shoots Bifrost at you. So it's like
I don't think so.
He'll like go up in the sky, and it's the same as like the fire, ice, and lightning poison missiles.
Did I do the Bifrost guy? I don't remember.
The problem with the Bifrost element is you can't block it, because if you do, you get the status effect anyways.
Right.
And so this guy does the missile, and your whole health bar is Bifrost, and you take one hit and die. And I got to the point where I was like, I need my health stone to revive when I will die. I need to have multiple abilities to spam. I need to pick runics that are as fast as possible and clap as much damage as possible in. I need stuff that's staggered. Like, everything is built to not engage with what the boss is doing, because the boss is built to frustrate. I did Gna, the Valkyrie Queen, which is the final post-game boss. She is quite probably the hardest boss fight in action games. Like that mantle went to Alma and Ninja Gaiden for like a decade and a half, and went to Sigrun in the previous God of War after. Like, Sigrun was the Valkyrie Queen in 2018, also had like I have the moveset of every Valkyrie. They're so fast. They hit you at the end of the game. I had defense only set, and it's like 2 hits to die. And it's constantly switching between unblockables, things that if you they're not unblockables, but if you block them, they still hurt you. Like, it's crazy. And the reply I saw from a lot of people was, here's how I beat it. I turned the difficulty down. Or I went to the accessibility settings and I set up the mode that is mini boss checkpoints. So this doesn't work on story bosses, but for all the side content, you can set up mid-health checkpoints for the boss, so that if you die during the boss fight, you restart with full everything, and the boss starts at the back half of the fight. And this was recommended on the official Twitter by the God of War people to be like, this is the correct way to engage with the game. If you are roadblocked, you lower the difficulty, which brings me to ranting about the difficulty system.
Yeah.
God of War 2018 has 4 difficulties. This game has 5. And I booted up my save of 2018, and I made a side save state of this game, and I put the difficulty down by 1 chunk. And I would say 2018's difficulty is close to give me story in this game.
Right.
The easy difficulty is maybe 20%, 25% harder than the previous game's normal. And this game, hard, like Gimme Balance, is somewhere above hard in this game. The main difference is the previous game made things tanky. Like, that was the way it did difficulty.
Mm-hmm.
This game makes damage spiky.
Yeah.
Things do get tankier over time, but it really is in the fact that like things just kill you if you don't dodge, parry, block in the perfect order.
Exactly right.
And I don't like that. This is when we get to doing Path of Exile versus Diablo 3 episodes, spike damage is a notoriously disliked way of tuning difficulty, because it's meant to prey on like reflexes, and it hurts people who are older. It hurts people who have accessibility problems, as opposed to ramping damage or health bars that went through pressure. Like, they get you over time because you're failing a mechanic 3-4 times in a fight, not once. Like, and not to things that are teleporting behind you while you're animation locked in a runic attack.
Yeah. And I gotta say, I think the reason this is even more egregious is that the first game exists already, setting a baseline expectation of what the game is going to feel like difficulty wise. And you kind of need to work within those parameters, or you're going to upset some people. Like,
the other part of this is how your level is relative to most of the game. So, having just finished the first one, you spend most of that game about 2 or 3 levels higher than the content from the midway point on.
Right.
Like if you do any kind of side quests, you're kind of over leveled. I was under leveled until the final hour of post game content when I actually hit level 9. Like I was constantly on par or a bit lower with the game. And my sense, based on how the design shakes and some of the stuff I've heard through the grapevine from other developers, is that they view how combat felt in 2018 as a failure. Like they actually wanted it to be closer to what it is now because they didn't feel like it was brutal enough in the previous game, where they felt like players who weren't playing on the final like turbo difficulty were kind of running roughshod over encounters they had crafted to be very difficult. Like they always wanted a brutal experience, which if that's the case, if you unwittingly back up into a Game of the Year nomination,
Yeah.
don't like work against yourself. I suppose is my feel with this. Like I'm not a person who did these encounters and was like, wow, I feel really rewarded having beat these. I feel an overwhelming sense of exhaustion with the Berserker fight and the Valkyrie Queen fights, which are really cool, by the way, in terms of how they look, and the characters are really like they're really interesting as side bosses, and they're like good payoffs to certain like the Berserker thing is a really good payoff to Mimir's side quests, and Gna closes off Freya's story because it has like a cutscene with her at the end, which is cool. But holy crap, are those fights like? Maybe I'm old. Maybe I want to play games like Assassin's. This has been an ongoing discussion between me and you because I had the same reaction to Elden Ring at the beginning of the year, where I'm like, maybe I do just want to play Assassin's Creed
No.
and Destiny. Maybe I do want to play things that aren't like demoralizing.
I don't think that's totally it here. Is like there's a version of this game where things are tighter, feel a bit more responsive, where it all lines up a bit better, because if swapping weapons felt good, if it felt like you had an opportunity to actually stagger bosses in the way they can stagger you as an out, if you didn't feel animation locked in the way that you do in this game, and the bosses are moving so damn quickly compared to the Souls series, like basically any swing that you take in this game that you're not 100% confident in is just going to fucking kill you. Like
I do dislike that essentially the entire game is driving you to build towards speed, but not because you want to play a fast gameplay style, because you just don't want to die. And that's the only defense in this game is be faster.
Yeah, that's another complaint I have with the game, is like, what is the point of that enormous talent tree you have in here? You clearly want me to play this in a particular way, so just auto level me to the way you want, and then let me do the encounters. Like the bosses aren't designed for like build flexibility, really. They don't feel that way.
The story bosses, I almost feel like they're the best part of the boss design.
But to me, they're also not bosses. Like none of them were hard at all.
So I actually had, I think it took me, I want to say like an hour to get through Heimdall, and maybe
really
45 minutes against Odin.
Okay, I one shot most of these bosses.
Thor was not particularly hard. Garm wasn't particularly hard. But my feel with them is like Heimdall preys on low reaction times, which I have, but I'm not like a high APM player. I haven't been in any game I've been playing last decade.
Oh, Heimdall was great, but it was one. It took me one.
Yeah,
I lost the attempt where I didn't have full health, as is par for the course in this game, and then I beat him the next time.
I think I got down the wolf or like the mount part like one shot, and then I had a couple of deaths against like the final. Maybe not like an hour, but a couple tries, whatever. Nothing like Hrolf and Gna account for, I think, between 5 and 6 hours of game.
I do love I love the boss design of all the mainline bosses, like mechanically, visually, the characters you're actually fighting with.
Very cool.
God, they're great.
They're like, that aspect I want to say is really cool. Odin is a very appropriate final boss and a really cool Odin.
Yeah.
And by the time you get to him, you are very invested. Apparently on higher difficulties, he is an absolute nightmare. Like in the difficulties that we didn't play in, it's like anything that touches you, you're dead. It is like a bullet hell fight for sure for people. Which, you know, like your mileage may vary on that, but like, so my feel with this is I like all the bosses. Everything that makes you fight one-on-one is better than anything that swarms you. Anything that swarms you I found to be okay at best, often tedious, sometimes very frustrating.
Just annoying.
Especially in I did die a lot in fights that had like multiple Bifrost Berserkers, or like the healing imp that's hidden behind crap that you can't see, and like you're having trouble with it.
There's one random fight with 2 Wolvar dudes and one of the little guys that makes them immune. And I was just so over that. And they're also shooting little Bifrost guys down from the sky on you in this thing.
Yeah.
And it never ends. It just goes on forever. And I'm just like, this sucks. Like
the side quests. So I want to talk about the importance of the side quests for a second. Some of them are fetch quests, and that's fine. The one place in the game where I found like I was getting very exhausted was the crater. Like the late Vanaheim part is so big at a time when you're already tired in the game. And I was like, okay. And it's not like you can do one of the 3. Like it's kind of an intricate, like you got to get the water going in one zone to fill up the other 2 so you can go access the fight. And it has like 7 dragon bosses. Like there are 3 big dragons and 2 of the big muscly drakes and 2 Dreki fights. The Dreki fights, I hate them, but like at that point in the game, you're kind of trashing them. The Drake fights, I think, are actually what the middling encounters in these games have been, which is like they reward you for blocking well. They're not really threatening. I think they're good training fights to have early in the game to get good fundamentals in. But shooting so many of them at the late game felt weird.
Yeah.
And the 3 dragons felt cool. They each have like unique boss patterns. They're very like Monster Hunter fights, really. No complaints, but I found the zone to be a bit long, and so side questing there, you go find the guy who jumped out of the ship in the Vanaheim rescue.
Oh, he made it?
Yeah, he makes it.
That's one of my favorite parts of the game.
Yeah, he's fighting the dragons. He's like wounded, and he's like, come help me out. And there's those guys, and there's a bunch of the travelers. And this off-screen wraps up a thing from like the 2018 and this game, which is like, why are there human berserkers fighting you?
Right.
Apparently there's like Odin in different guises convinced them that like if they travel the 9 realms and find the God of War, they'll find paradise, which is Jotunheim. And so they're kind of like sleeper agents for Odin, but they don't know it. And I'm like, it was like cool, but like, you could have dropped this like way earlier in the story, because like this is kind of very late. There's also a bunch of post-game side quests. So one of them is very short. It's a wake for Brock. And it's like a Viking funeral, and it has Sindri and Freya, and it has some like very poignant emotional moments with cutscenes that are main story cutscenes. Like they're not like side quest discussions. They're full on like, oh, this is part of the story. It's an epilogue, which I think sort of disarms a bit the idea that like Sindri might be a boss in next games. Like he's like looking less messed up when you see him. He's still angry, but I was like, this is very good for Sindri. Then there's the Na stuff with Freya. I'm like, this is very good for Freya. And then the whole Berserker quest line explains to you why Mimir ends up with the Aesir and is cathartic for him. And I was like, these are like really good, and they're all post-game, and a lot of the mid-game side quests are for nameless NPC spirits that you don't care about. And I don't understand, why they're... I guess I kind of understand, because these cap off the game, but I'm like, you're so tired. A lot of players, I imagine, are like you and are not going to want to go back and finish these. And it sucks that they're all at the end of all of this when you probably aren't going to get to see them. Also, do you want me to spoil you the last 2 side quests?
Yes.
One is
I'm never turning this game on again.
So the Odin's Ravens thing you end up fighting like the Raven Keeper, who is like a satyr witch who killed all the ravens to make them into Odin's pets.
Okay.
And it's a dual satyr fight ice dragon fight in Niflheim, which is really cool. Like you fight her and then it swaps to the dragon. It's not both at the same
Okay.
time. It's cool. Like it actually works. It's a really cool set piece fight against like a side quest. And the post game stuff that ends up is like Asgard imploded, but there's a lot of like pieces that dropped everywhere. So there's like a couple of like go fight like a Einherjar side boss or whatever. And in Niflheim, it fully drops a jail. And in the jail, there are many dead beings. And at the bottom of the jail is the actual Tyr who is alive.
Oh, cool.
And it like shows up in the post game and is like, oh shit, I guess a lot of stuff happened. I should reflect on this. And you realize the jail is effectively like all the people that Odin impersonates because he can't impersonate dead people.
Huh.
So I'm like, this also, if you put the jail in the middle of the story and you're like, why does Odin have a jail full of living people that seem to be nameless NPCs and elves and shit? And it's like, oh, Odin's just been going around manipulating shit. There's a lot of stuff where I'm like, this stuff is really cool. If it wasn't locked behind like a game that frustrated me so much, I probably would have like felt much better about it. But it locks all of the end beats for the side characters in that in a way that I'm not like the biggest fan of. I am happy that they didn't do that for like, well, the real ending of the story between Kratos and Atreus is behind all of the side quests that you have to now complete.
That was my fear. And when
No,
you
they
told me
didn't
you were
do
going to
that.
platinum the game, I was like, well, good. You can just tell me.
No, it's a lot of I think good closure for all of the important side characters. But the Atreus and Kratos story is fully closed in that. You get some stuff where you get to see like Sif and Hildisvini are like rebuilding in Vanaheim, and Thrud picks up Thor's hammer in like she's just chilling in Niflheim, and she's like now training to use the hammer and stuff.
Cool. She
So
deserves
there's
it.
like
She's best
there's a lot of
character in
that
that
kind
game.
of stuff. Well, is she the best?
No.
I kind of really like. I think I do think Sindri is kind of the underrated star of this game in a lot of ways.
No,
He has a lot
I
of
like Thor in this quite a bit, actually. I do like
Yeah.
I like their family. I thought they were interesting, and I kind of wish Thor got a bit more time.
Heimdall's a piece of shit though.
Oh, Heimdall's brutal. You want to kill that guy right away.
Like immediately in the first minute, I'm like, oh, of course Ragnarok's happening. Look at this guy.
He's an asshole.
So I think that's my like overall, like story for me, like a 8.59 for games especially. But even if this was like a movie, this would be like a very competent blockbuster movie. Music 10, environmental design 10, the worlds 10, combat. If I'm talking about general mobs, it's like a 5. If I'm talking about bosses, it ranges from like a 7 to a 9 depending on the boss.
Okay.
Like that, because I think the bosses overall are less brutal on the like you need to use this weapon or swap as much.
Right.
Traversal and puzzles, like a 7 or a 7.5. Like it's par for the course for AAA game design. Like I have no feelings about it one way or another. Itemization, bad. But I think generally,
yeah, we didn't even get into this. Did nothing for me.
Well, so no, my problem is this: itemization, runes and skills, and combat are all part of the same problem, which is runic doesn't work properly. This is a general consensus from a lot of players: is runic is just a bad stat this time around. Like it's just not good, which means that like spells suck, and armor that is for spells sucks. Cool that like there are builds for defense, vitality, cooldown is not usable because it's tied to runic. and strength. So you get like vitality, defense, and strength are the 3 stats that are worth building into, and they don't functionally change your core gameplay that much. And your skills are probably the skills that you use anyways on your controller, and the rest don't matter as much because you don't use them that much. And that's kind of it. So I think like a lot of that part is because the combat don't work so good, it kind of bleeds into a lot of the stuff that you need to build for combat, which is a bummer.
Yeah. So I mean, here's my takeaway from this, because I don't really like to rate this like in a star or number scale, but here's how I was thinking about this game after it was done, because I was extremely frustrated and tired a lot of the time as I was playing this. Like, and keep in mind, I played Elden Ring for like what 75 hours to get through that game, and I was never tired of that game. I know you were, but like
I was tired.
this game, I was fatigued almost immediately. I was just like, I don't think this is going to be great.
It's the longest 30-hour game.
Well, that's right. It took me almost exactly 30 hours to finish this game. And 30 hours.
Yeah, I think I'm at 42 for the platinum.
30 hours is 3 seasons of a TV show. Was this game as good as The Leftovers? Was this game as good as the first 3 seasons of Fargo? No.
People listening to this should know that Mark is a very discerning TV watcher in general.
Is this 30 hours as good? Is the first 12 hours of this game as good as Andor? Not really, but I think if we're comparing this to a film or a TV show, and I think the strength of this game is in its narrative, right? It's in the story.
Yeah.
You can even compare it to an anime you like if you want to, because those run, if you're watching a few seasons, fairly close to 15 to 30 hours, depending on the length, right? Is this as good as any of those? I mean, parts of it, yes, but if we're looking at it narratively, it's as that kind of entertainment, it's very excessively padded. And depending on who you are, that padding is either going to enhance the experience or detract from it immensely, right? Like, it doesn't necessarily make the story worse in its construction, but for me, the padding here just didn't do anything good. And I would still say this. I would still recommend that you play this game. And if you are frustrated and tired by it, just do what the developers told you to do and turn down the difficulty. But I don't think that we should accept that as like, this is the way you should continue to design games, because I think the baseline, the default experience of this, if you change nothing, should be a bit tighter. It should align more with the game that this is following. I think there's a lot of reasons that this feels disjointed to us as an experience and why it was tiring, because we're not really getting what we expected. And then when we factor this into our personal ecosystem of the artistic products that we consume, does this live up to the same kind of space as an artisanal product of games, which you're going to put up against artisanal film, artisanal music, artisanal TV? Like, the prestige would be another word we use for that. Is this like a coextensive experience? Does this compare with them in a positive way? Ish. My answer is ish. It sort of does, but I actually don't think that this is totally there in a way that I think the first game really set this up to succeed in that way. And I don't think this delivered. And part of the reason it didn't deliver for me is the padding didn't work. And if the padding worked for you, it's not padding. It creates this really great 45-hour arc of beauty and wonder where we're actually just kind of opposites on this. And like, Elden Ring is that for me. And
well, I think what happened with Elden Ring is I had the U experience where you built Runic in this way and I built Strength in Elden Ring, and it felt terrible. Like, it felt like the game was just built to punish me, which now you understand.
Yeah. Well, I understood it then too. I was like, I get it.
But I suppose my final note is this. I mentioned I played 2018, but I also made a side save because I was like, I'm gonna do the Muspelheim challenges. I might as well try on different difficulties. This game is better on lower difficulties. Like straight up, my exact first answer was, wow, I wish I just played this on, maybe not Give Me Story, but like give me like the second one right after that.
Right.
The game would have been better. Period. Because I feel like because it lowers the damage gate and the resistance gate on monsters, it opens up builds. Because you feel less taxed by the like the way that the difficulty is instantiated, you feel freer. And you can go to places that have monsters that are maybe a level higher than you or two. And those places are tough, but they're not undoable. And I'm like, oh, this just feels better. And so outright, I'm going to say, unless you're someone who enjoys really frustrating, like difficult games, I wouldn't even put Elden Ring in this.
No.
I feel like you need to enjoy hard difficulty Neo. You need to enjoy things like Ninja Gaiden, and then I would say play it at Give Me Balance. And if not, I would say put it down and amp up the difficulty if you feel it's too easy. Don't start high and amp down. Start easy and maybe up it. There's no trophies locked out if you start easy. Everything is gettable at the lowest difficulty of this. Despite that, by the way, only like 2% of players have platinums on this, which is pretty intense. And I would say still a strong recommend from me, but I think I sit kind of where the community sits on this, which is like, this is kind of like it's like an 8.5 to a 9 game for me. And I understand, the sentence I had for you is like, this game is simultaneously a 10 and a 7, depending on where you are and what you're doing, where it can feel like mediocre at sometimes and like one of the best games I've played in the last decade otherwise. And yeah, I suppose we're going to talk more about it next week when we start doing our Game Awards predictions.
Yeah, we will.
Because I think this game, we've been sort of softly like talking about it as a competitor to Elden Ring, but it is very much like we are heading in 2 weeks to the showdown between Elden Ring and God of War on a number of categories, including game of the year.
Yeah, it's going to be a battle, but I guess let's not spoil where we're heading with that discussion for next week.
So, yeah.
Well, that was God of War, and that was CTG Weekly. So
it's a long one.
That's a long one for sure. So thanks for listening if you stuck it out, and I hope you liked the game more than I did. I think there's a lot there to love. But for Mark and Andre, we'll see you next time.
Bye.